Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is the Wily Coyote, exploring the life of a clever canid. And it will be presented by our fabulous Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Kristina Disney. Kristina, welcome back. Thank you so much for presenting today. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thank you so much, Sunny, and I am very excited to talk about one of my favorite furry friends out in the wilderness. And I thought I would start us off today with a bit of a story before we leave this beautiful picture here. I love those eyes looking off into the distance. It always seems like they can see around the corner or see around the bend. And I will jump in, but I just want to start us off with an excerpt, actually, from Lewis and Clark. Well, specifically from Lewis, who I never realized this, but Lewis's first name is Meriwether. And I always think it's kind of funny because you look back at these old explorers and it's John or William, or I can always guess it. So I really appreciate the first name that breaks the pattern. So Meriwether Lewis wrote this on May 5th, 1805. At the time, they were in northeastern Montana, which is only a few hundred miles south of where I'm currently sitting. I've come home to the prairies briefly for the springtime. So that was the inspiration for our focus on coyotes today. But let's hear what Meriwether Lewis had to say to describe the coyote. The small wolf or burrowing dog of the prairies are the inhabitants almost invariably of the open plains. They usually associate in bands of 10 or 12, sometimes more, and burrow near some pass or place much frequented by game. Not being able alone to take a deer or goat, they rarely ever are found alone but hunt in bands. They frequently watch and seize their prey near their burrows. In these burrows they raise their young, and to them they also resort when pursued. When a person approaches them, they frequently bark, their note being precisely that of a small dog. They are of an intermediate size between that of a fox and dog, very active, fleet, and delicately formed. The ears large and erect and pointed, the head long and pointed, more like that of the fox. Tail long, the hair and fur also resembles the fox, though is much coarser and inferior. They are a pale reddish-brown color, the eyes a deep sea-green color, small and piercing. Their claws are rather longer than those of the ordinary wolf, or that common to the Atlantic states, none of which are to be found in this quarter, nor, I believe, above the River Platte. Which is quite a very thorough and kind of majestic description, I would say, of the coyote, which I think is much different than what most folks would picture when they think about a coyote. And I'm even going to change the name as I say it. I think for most folks, when they picture the Wile E. Coyote, we can thank Looney Tunes for the first image that comes to mind. And this is certainly, I think, the one for me that comes to mind is when he's chasing Roadrunner, and it's that very stereotypical moment where in his foolishness or in his excitement, he runs right off the edge of the cliff, and Looney Tunes in their wisdom freezes time for us to get to see that look on his face when he realizes the mistake that he's made and that he's about to fall, defying physics along the way. So the coyote has really transformed this notion of what we see it as and where it fits into our lives. For many people, it's the butt of the joke from our childhood cartoons. For some people, it's a howl off in the distance, something they never really see. For some people, it's eerie. For some people, it's comforting. For me, that sound means I've come home. It means it's a complicated sound in the way that it fits into my lifestyle and the lifestyle of my family, but it's a big part of my life. And so I'm going to start us off and just kind of share a little bit of that. So this is what it looks like where I grew up. It doesn't look like that exactly right now because we just had a snowstorm follow me in, and that there's no green grass yet. For anyone who does live in the Midwest or on the prairies or Montana, things don't look green like this in our corner of the world until about June. This time of year, it's buried in snow or a couple different hazy shades of brown before the grass starts to grow. But it's a really beautiful landscape if you're from here or if you get an eye for it. But our hills are made of clay because all this used to be an inland sea at one point in time. So there's all these marine deposits, and it also means that our hills don't really support a lot of life. They're pretty barren looking. It's one of the reasons why a lot of places around here get nicknamed the Badlands. And wherever animals roam, it's very easy to find, right? You can see this trail coming in along the right, going off into the distance. And the reality is that's either made by some cows that are on their way to a waterer, or it's the deer, or it's the coyotes. The coyotes themselves will keep the same path. They have their own little routes they like to take as they go between the hills. And it's a very, very homey sight. I flew home about a week ago when I was driving from the airport. My mom picked me up, and I'm driving us back to our farm, which is a few hundred kilometers, so a little more than 150 miles south of where the airport is. And lo and behold, the first thing that I see running through the field along the road is a coyote, which for me is that very welcome sign that I've come home. And there are things that I just grew up knowing about coyotes. Believe it or not, one of the things was that a coyote is one of, well, as far as I know, it's the only animal, but I'll be kind and say one of the few that looks both ways before they cross the road. And you might think I'm joking, but I have seen it, and they know exactly what a road is and how it works. I can also tell you that coyotes hunt alone where I grew up. It's very, very rare to see them as a pack, so maybe a bit different from Lewis's story. But again, the world's a different place. Another thing is that when you're hunting a coyote, one thing is patience. So when you hunt a coyote, the thing about it is that when they're running, they'll run and then they always pause once and they look back at you. For anyone who, if you are a hunter, that's the moment that you wait for. You don't try and shoot them on the run. And some people might be saying, if this is the first time you're tuning in, or if you've maybe come and listened to some of the webinars before, Kristina, why are we talking about hunting? We're focused on conservation. Well, I think that those lines, I'm not going to say that they get blurred, but I think that people wear many hats. So in the same way that I grew up and became a polar bear guide and moved to the north, younger me was a kid on a farm. And on that farm, one of the things we did was hunt coyotes. And it's probably something, and maybe something that will happen this spring coming back. And I'm going to bring us back to that story, but it's because lives are complicated, and how we best support our own livelihood and the lives around us is also a complicated thing. But the story of the coyote and sort of my visit here to home is all kind of tied together. But I think it's because it's the way that we look at the world and how it's, I could say that my relationship to the coyote is a function of my environment and a function of my generation. But we'll kind of tie that into a few different things as we go here. So if we think about, I've said it a couple times now, and I've even said it a few different times, I've said the word coyote. Now, some folks out there, depending on where you're from, you might be saying, what about the Wily Coyote, right? Well, that word comes to us from much further south than where I'm currently sitting, but it's spread all across North America. And that is rooted in the Aztec language. I'm gonna not do this very well. Nahuatl. And so the first written account that we have of the word that would become coyote came to us in 1824. A guy by the name of Willem Bullock, he wrote 6 months residence and travels in Mexico. And at that time, there was a couple different variations of the word going around. One of it was Cayjotte, right, with the J that would turn into jote, quejote, as well as coxiote, right? And so the word, the spelling has changed and become standardized. And that kicked in around the 1880s. And so today, depending on where you're from and where you're at in the world, most people in the states, in the western states and central, and a little bit north, you would have it as a 2-syllable word. If you are from the south, closer to the origin of the word, you probably still hold it as a 3-syllable word. Or in the case, if you've only ever had exposure through Looney Tunes, you would also say coyote. There's not a wrong one. It's kind of this very easy reflection of your culture and how that ties in. So if the word came from the south, where did the coyotes come from? And that in itself is a pretty cool, complicated, and interesting question. So this is the approximate range of coyotes today, and it's done in this color heat map, it's actually a really cool map. I quite like it, but it shows you, so the dark red in the center is the oldest known sort of range, let's say, and they've got this for the last 100 years. So they've got that from about the 1900s. And I don't know if anyone who's staring this map has noticed something rather peculiar about it. But unlike most species maps, and I'm going to say specifically unlike most predator maps, this range has expanded and not contracted with the passage of time, which is more or less the exact opposite than any other medium to large size predator that we know of in North America. I'm not going to speak for Asia because I'm not as in tune with their ecology, but this is crazy in the sense that actually coyotes appear to be doing better since since Europeans came to North America. And so it's tied in both with the way that people live and the ecosystem, right? The reason why I wanted to backtrack on that word is because it's not that the humans weren't there before, right? We've had people on this land since time immemorial, but it's the way that those humans have lived that have made such a big distinction, so that by the time we get to 2016, we've got them moving all across pretty much all of the US is now inhabited. It's made their way up through Canada, into Alaska, to our eastern coast, and even down, if people are looking there, into Central America, which is quite the spread. So where is that possible, and how is that possible? Well, the popular narrative used to be tied to this notion that coyotes could only exist on a true prairie ecosystem. And so this map, what you're seeing here, is showing you what would have been pre-existing forest cover, and then those dots. This is from that study, so that really cool color map. These are the dots that these are the samples that made up that map, so that they could kind of prove and disprove those things. So some of those samples are really quite old, right? You're looking up to about 10,000 years old. Some of them are preserved samples, right? So things that are in museums and personal taxidermy collections, things like that, right? They're using those to date the range of these, as well as fossils and things like that. And so the popular narrative was that coyotes only existed in the prairies, and that they kind of were stuck between the Rocky Mountains and between the Mississippi, and then maybe they got as far north as central Canada and south as central Mexico. But that narrative has been changing quite a bit. So that was kind of, let's say, expert in the 1950s. That's how they thought things were working. But people have gone back and reassessed that. And what they found, if we go on the westward side, is that there is lots of stories, and both from different indigenous folks, as well as the journals, people like Lewis and Clark, things like that, of there being a wider expanse of them down in, west into California, as well as south into Mexico. We're not really sure their most northern and southern extent. The reality is there's actually fossils there from a really long time ago, but then there's less, I'm going to say, physical evidence in the last like 500 years, which is why this story is a little bit confusing. But the likelihood is that it was much more broad than that. But the important thing to note is that it's not so much about their range in this story, it would be about their presence or their density. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because, yes, it was likely that they probably did have a wider range, but they were probably less dense, and that is because of competition, right? So again, there would have been wolves, bears, cougars, right? Going south for those in Central America, starting to hit some jaguars down there. All of those are competing for a lot of the same prey food resources as the coyote now occupies as a predator in the ecosystem today. So that means that, yes, there probably was a wider spread of coyotes, but they probably weren't as many of them. So again, if we tie that together, then it makes sense if we think about the expansion of the coyote as we see it today. So looking at North America, how is it that the coyote has managed to proliferate so much and cover so much ground? Well, we are tied to that narrative very strongly. And some of it is true, and some of it is simply how we perceive the world. Part of it, one of the big factors, is because when European settlers came, competition with and fear of larger predators, right? So there wasn't that fear. Even think about that note of Lewis's journal. He wasn't afraid of the coyote as he was describing it. He was talking about, if you approach them, this is what happened, right? So the way that they socially organized and their size meant that people weren't quite as afraid of them. So they didn't get hunted necessarily in the same way. But wolves were already feared, right? They already had wolves in Europe. And bears were feared. Cougars were feared. And so those animals were shot on sight or killed on sight. They were trapped, they were poisoned, depending on the era that we're talking here. And so if you get rid of that niche, if you get rid of and you create a vacuum, which is essentially what happened, it allows for smaller mesopredators to bump up, level up, and start filling in some of those roles. Because it's true that while we think about, wolves being majestic hunters and taking down elk and caribou and things like that, they also eat mice and voles, and they will also scavenge, right? Being that higher level predator means that you're eating a wide range of things. Some of them do specialize. That can be very regional. But again, these animals can also be quite generalist. So human behavior, right there, one of the reasons why the coyotes can make some moves. Next one has to do with our source of food. So again, settlers come in, the pioneers. My grandparents, they settled in the prairies in 1910 or 1911, excuse me, with I think they bought their, I think it was a township of land, so 100 quarter sections for like, I don't know what it was, $8 or $12, something ridiculous like that back in the day, right? But it was the expansion of agriculture. And what does agriculture do? Well, it does grow us a lot of food that we do rely on and certainly need, but it also takes out forests and parkland, and it creates this flat, open expanse, which was not great. Wolves are, unless we're going to way up north, most of our wolf species prefer hunting in the woods. Cougars do not like open spaces. Bears, also not big fans of them, right? These are all forest-dwelling predators, and now their ecosystem has been reduced. But the coyote, who is very comfortable in the open and is used to hunting in that type of ecosystem, it is allowed to flourish. Now, the other interesting thing is that, so those are kind of the environmental aspects, but then there's also some genetic aspects that come into play. Again, when we think about coyotes, we said we called them the clever canid, right? So we're in that canine family, wolves, dogs. There is so much genetic plasticity, right? Think about how many different dog breeds there are. It's sort of crazy that everything from a Chihuahua to a Saint Bernard to a German Shepherd is still somehow a dog, Canis familiaris. And so even though we're going to call them cousins, there's still some genetic overlap there, enough to the point that they can make viable offspring. So this fella that you're looking at here is a hybridization. So what happened in eastern North America, so in along our Atlantic coast there, is that there were coyotes, or the coyotes are sort of encroaching eastward. The existing wolf population is declining because A, lack of forests, B, hunting pressures, which means that there are fewer wolves, and that fragmented population of the eastern wolf starts mating with the expanding westward coyote. So this hybrid, which some folks call coy wolves, other people maybe not quite such a fan. They're not coy wolves because they're shy, but again, they're a cross between the two. So if we look at that, some very cool genetic studies have been done on the coyote population along the Atlantic here, or along the eastern side. You can tell I'm from the west. Hey, my range of where I want to use as identifiers is a bit off. But so what they've done is they've looked and they found that of these eastern coyotes, if they look at their genetics, 64% will say is original coyote DNA, but it's now been mixed in with about 13% gray wolf, 13% eastern wolf, and then also about 10% dog, right? So depending on the interaction, sometimes when coyotes and dogs meet, it ends up with one eating the other or fighting the other. Sometimes if it's the right time of year and the right set of conditions, then they will mate, right? But they don't form mating pairs in the same way, and the family structure doesn't end up the same. But again, so that genetic plasticity kicks in, and some interesting things that come out of that. So these hybrids, which again, most, depending on who you talk to, you're talking to a wolf conservationist, they don't like them being called coy wolves. But these eastern coyotes, these hybrids are quite a bit bigger than, we'll say, your classic coyote. So the coyotes that I grew up with, they're anywhere, if the male is about 20 to 40 pounds, females maybe 15 to 40. Very rare for us to see a 50-pound coyote. If you go further north, they get a bit bigger. But these coyotes that have crossbred with the wolves out east, they're about 55 pounds heavier than, let's say, a pure coyote. So they're clocking in around more like 80, 90 pounds. And so they're sharing their weight. They're also sharing the hunting strategies of those eastern wolves. So partially because of their larger size and some other traits that they've inherited, they're more successful at hunting in that fragmented woods, plus in the open expanse out there as well. So they've got the edge. Depending on who you talk to, people say that there's actually more of like millions of these hybrids. Like that is the subspecies there now. And another interesting thing is that even, I haven't been out there, so I have yet to prove this one. So maybe someone can comment if you are from out east. But they say that even their cries blend with the ancestry. So they say that the first part of the howl is deep. It's got a deep pitch like a wolf. But then as you get to the end of the howl, it turns into that higher pitch sort of coyote yip, which I thought was kind of cool. That even the sounds of their voices have blended together. We do not call this a new species. We don't call, yeah, most people would refer to them as wolves. At least genetically, everyone is still on board with them being coyotes. And there's a lot of diversity in coyotes, right? We're talking about that expansion. They're expanding into different ecosystems. They're crossbreeding with, especially further south, more with dogs. And so right now, we have them at about 19 or 20 different subspecies. And so that's spread out all across North America. And you can almost kind of see sort of that 10, you could maybe argue is 10 and 11 would be some of the original populations. And then you could say that as they've expanded, the distinction between those subspecies has really grown. And part of that is just space and time, right? If you move away from your family, you start picking up habits from further away, or start breeding in a smaller cluster, so your genetic diversity changes. And one thing I just want to point out on this before I move on, because I always think this is so funny. So if you want to take a look at the transition between 11, 10, and 8, this is a very perfect example. If you ever see a straight line on a map, especially if it's something to do with biology or ecology, it's not real. It means I don't know. That is a best guess from someone who's like, I don't know, the line is somewhere in here. These things, I mean, it's in human nature to group things, right? We like to put them into tidy boxes and say that this is where the division is and this is my side and that's yours. But the reality is that it is gray and messy, and that all of these are blurred, right? When we say subspecies, there's nothing that's stopping a coyote in group 10 just trotting up and breeding with someone in group 8, right? But we have to, in order for us to kind of wrap our heads around it, we always have to sort of group things. And so whenever you see maps like this, one, never trust straight lines. Two, always remember these lines are blurry. They are never a perfect distinction. All right. So let's go back to our Wily Coyote. So they have existed for a very long time alongside humans in various different capacities. And I would certainly argue that their perception in our world has drastically changed. There was a time, and they still are, I should say, but for a lot of different cultures that existed here pre-colonial settlement, the coyote represented one of survival in face of persecution. They represented intelligence, adaptability, resilience, and in a lot of cultures, they were sort of their position in the cosmology was of a trickster god. Um, and so tricksters are these interesting things that play a very serious role in a lot of different cultures of showing us either growing beyond what currently exists or bringing in different elements that are key to human survival. But they're this line of creativity and imagination, and often foolishness, because it goes hand in hand. You kind of have to be willing to go out on a limb and fail if you're really going to do something spectacular, or if you're really going to do some change. So, but that's not how most people know coyotes today. Some people consider them pests, or if we're just, yeah, most folks, when I think about them in a cartoonish sense, we've got Wily here lighting his own tail on fire rather than finally getting his chance to catch Roadrunner. So if we go back and we think about where coyotes have fit into stories before Looney Tunes got a hold of them, we can go back to this map of kind of where some of these older specimens were found. And coyotes, their stronger place as a trickster is more in those cultures that existed on the plains and kind of the Midwest. And what's interesting is that if you go further north, so if you go into northern Saskatchewan, Alberta, and further north up there, then you're switching narratives where it's the raven in a lot of those cultures that takes on the role of creator and trickster rather than the coyote. But they share a lot of commonalities. All that being said, they're lovers, magicians, sometimes they're gluttons. But I want to hone in on a couple different cultures. There are many stories and many different renditions, but there's just a couple stories that I'd like to share, just because I want to show different aspects of how coyote fits into culture, and also, just that it goes a lot further back than I think most people would think at surface level. So the first example that I want to share today is from the Navajo. So coyotes have had a role in the Navajo culture, or certainly they start at the very beginning of the creation myth. And so in Navajo, they have what's called the story of the people, which is essentially this prehistoric emergence of humans into what is now Earth. And it starts off with the holy wind creates creatures of mist and light, and then it sort of animates and it brings out the first four people who are the holy people. And they're supernatural, and they exist in these different sacred, multiple tiered or lower worlds. And so, with the creation, the first world or the dark world is quite small. It's centered on this island floating in the middle of the four seas. And the inhabitants of this first world were the four supernatural people, two coyotes, four rulers of the four seas. There were mist beings and various insects and bat people, also those belonging to the air and spirit people. Now, these supernatural beings, of them, that came to be the first woman and the first man, and they came to meet because they saw each other's fires burning on either side of the island, and that's how they got together. Now, there came a time when then this group journeyed to the second world, or the blue world, and this was inhabited then by the different blue or gray-furred mammals, various birds. And when they were there, the supernatural beings, they offended the swallow chief, and they were asked to leave. So at that point, they went on and they moved to the third world, or the yellow world, on which there were two rivers, and those that formed, and they crossed the sacred mountains. But yet there was still no sun. But here there were yet more animal people that also lived. And so this time, it wasn't there was a discord or a disagreement that caused the first peoples to leave and the coyote to leave, but it's because Coyote went and stole one of Water Buffalo's children, or stole her two children, which caused there to be a great flood. And so then they were forced to move on to the fourth world, at which point it was covered in water and there were monsters living there. And so they took the sacred mountains and reformed the soil from them, and they borrowed those from the second world. And the first man and the first woman and the holy people, from these they created the sun, the moon, the seasons, and the stars. It was also at this point in time that death was brought into existence. And it was Coyote that brought death into the world. So at this point, the true death came, and what the Coyote did was, after the worlds were created, Coyote tossed a stone into a lake and declared that if it sank, then it would only be the dead that could go back to the previous worlds, and therefore we were stuck in this plane of existence. Which I think is kind of a beautiful metaphor, or a beautiful transition. I don't know if folks noticed it, but there was also some interesting tie-ins to other culture stories, right? Talking about the Great Flood and how that fits in to so many different stories all around the world. So many different cultures share that commonality. And so Coyote's role in Navajo culture, he causes the flood, or he's the originator of death. Also in the creation of stars, he gets impatient at one point and throws them. And so for some versions of the story, that's why we have the Milky Way, because the other stars, when that God was creating those stars, he would shine them each bright and blow fire into them. But before he could do that for these stars, Coyote was impatient and just threw them into the sky. Another version is that those stars are there to guide spirits across the plains or across the realms. But an interesting thing goes back to is that if there was uncertainty at any point, it said that the animals and the people would go to Coyote and they'd say, if no one knew what to do, they would always ask Coyote, right? So there's a sense of knowledge, of wealth tied in there as well. So we can see that, again, tied back into creation myths. And I'm also going to switch to another nation. So First Nation here now in BC, so up along the coast there, or sorry, inland from the coast, more interior, is the Silex and the Sequapik. So this is in the Okanagan Valley, if anyone's ever traveled there. And for these people, for this nation, Coyote is very much considered a hero. True, he has very many tricks and foolish ways, but he always kind of comes out on top. And for their stories, Coyote often doesn't work alone. He's accompanied by Fox, who sort of helps him out when his curiosity or his mischievous ways gets him into too much trouble. Coyote is also the one that's responsible for bringing food, plants, medicines, and elements into the natural world. And so it's also Coyote that brings and shapes this notion of consciousness for humans, right? So the equivalent for some folks who are more familiar with Western myths might be Prometheus, right? The bringer of fire, things like that. You maybe even draw some parallels to Pandora and the opening of the box. So I'm going to share one story from this nation, just to share a different side, different facet of Coyote. And that was the day that Coyote was watching Eagle. So he saw eagles soaring up on these high cliffs, high above these cliffs on these big air drafts. An eagle would swoop down and scream and then ride these hot waves of air back up. And it just looked like so much fun. And so Coyote watched and watched, and he said to himself, those are my ways. And with this in mind, he climbed all the way up the cliff, and he kept watching Eagle and thinking to himself, those are my ways. And it was super hard work, but he was determined to get to the top. And after climbing all day, he got himself to the top of the cliff. And he walked to the edge, and without even hesitating, he jumped off, intending to catch the next updraft and soared, just like he saw Eagle did. And with his skinny arms and legs, he couldn't fly. He just plummeted downward. So he frantically was flapping his arms and twirling his tail. He was trying to get anything to help him to fly, but he just kept going all the way down. And he became so afraid that he screamed and pooped all the way to the bottom, where he splattered to pieces. And to this day, there's a long white streak from the top to the bottom of that mountain to remind us of Coyote's journey. Now, sometime later, Coyote's brother Fox came along, and Fox had heard that Coyote's foolishness had again caused his death. So Fox carefully gathered all the bits and pieces of Coyote that he could find. Over here, a few pieces of hairs, a couple teeth he found on a rock, some bone, everything he could sort of manage to scrimp or scrape off the edge where Fox had, or where Coyote had tumbled to his death. When Fox figured that he'd gotten as much of him together as he possibly could, he put it all into a pile and he breathed into it. And then he stepped over it 4 times. And then the pile transformed itself back into Coyote. Coyote sat up, rubbed his eyes, and chastised Fox for waking him up. Coyote said to Fox, I must have just dozed off for a few minutes, and then here you are waking me up. What's wrong with you? Fox just shook his head as Coyote carried on his way as if nothing had happened. Right? And so if we were all sitting in a room together, I would ask what that story meant to you and and what you kind of took from it. I guess for me, when I think about it, right, it's kind of like you got to be willing to fully commit, and maybe you can do it, maybe you can't. It's also sort of this notion of limitations and maybe understanding your place. This time when I read it, not that this would have helped him, but I didn't notice it until this time, is that so you in the summertime you need the heat from the sun to get those really good updrafts. So eagles will only do that in the daytime right off of those edges, but when nighttime comes they can't actually do it with the same amount because there's not heat from the daytime. So it's this interesting notion of timing where even if Coyote had been a bird, it wouldn't have been the time to do it. So it's kind of like he's edging into this world that he doesn't understand, but he has a lot of big hopes and ambitions. So I kind of got to hand it to him for that. And so for their culture, there's a few people that have gone and that have shared these stories. They talk about how Coyote has this gift from creation. He has this ability to transform, to overcome what they term as monsters. And so monsters in this notion are these technologies, practices, these ideals, or even cultural patterns that are destructive and unsustainable. But this notion is that for humans to maintain in balance, or to have this sustained balance with their ecology, you've got to kind of be continuously gathering bits together. So one man said it's in the same notion of, in the same way that Fox gathers together Coyote, that bits of creativity, bits of knowledge, and bring it back together. Right. But another thing that was shared after reading this story, which I really appreciated because I think it brings a lot back to the power of stories. So the man who shared the story originally with Professor Cohen, he said, many things about the story are funny, but the story is not funny. The purpose is to convey a moral message, and we use humor in an entertaining way because we're more likely to remember it. And it's for children, but it's also for adults, right? And it's a very simple story that we all sort of laugh about, but it makes, we all laugh. Of course, Coyote couldn't fly, but it's this very distinct way of just demonstrating possibilities and limitations in the world. And this notion that we have Coyote there, that if he did not do all those things, then those things would not be possible in the world. But through his actions, we can also see the responses and the extent of which, if we're going to make an attempt, right, there is this finite amount. And especially for children, right, it teaches us about the boundaries of our world, which is still true for us as adults. So there's so much to be learned from there. And I know for myself, I certainly carry a lot of Coyote stories with me from my youth. They're very much a part of my childhood. a part of our culture, right? Every farm where I have has a dog, and even if that dog isn't necessarily a hunter, it's just having that dog keeps the coyotes around, or excuse me, keeps the coyotes from coming in too close. My mom was gone for a week, a little while, and we could see the coyote tracks all over our yard, right? They'll come and eat the cats. And they are extremely clever. I made that joke, or not a joke, but they do look both ways before they cross the road. Coyotes where I'm from have also been known to call out tame dogs. So those dogs that we do keep, there'll be 2 or 3 coyotes, and sometimes they'll go sit on the ridge, just kind of almost out of sight. You can hear them call and howl, and it'll, depending on the dogs you have, if they're not smart enough, they'll hear that and they'll go out to see what it is, and then the 3 coyotes will attack the dog and eat it. Again, not a great story, but it was one of the things that are true from where I grew up. Another one was there's a couple national parks close to where I live, or actually the story is a bit from a bit further away. But so at the national parks, the one there, they've got bison, they've also got a lot of elk. And so along the roads there, they have those really tall fences, those elk fences to keep those animals in. And so it's great, keeps them off the divided highways, keeps them safe from that. But the coyotes figured out that unlike other fences, the elk couldn't get through this one. So even though normally elk would be something that they wouldn't take down, packs of coyotes in this area started hunting, and they would force the elk to the edge of the fence and then nip at it until it essentially got exhausted because there's nowhere to go. They knew that it was basically like facing a barrier, right? Which is quite intelligent if you really think about it. And this time of year, so it's springtime, and with spring comes birth of lots of cute little babies. For us on our farm right now, we've got some baby calves on the way. There are 3 this year, and they're just getting started. We've got about 90 to calve out. This is a picture of my mom. Well, this is from last year because we're only just starting this year, but there's a few of the little calves that are hanging out by us while their moms are eating hay, and then that's my mom. When they're born in the snow, if they get too cold, we'll bring them in, and if we have to bottle feed them, but mostly we just have to warm them up. And then, especially that first day, they're very perceptible, or yeah, they're very vulnerable to the cold. Maybe is a better way to say it. And like a lot of ungulates, baby cows, little calves, are quite amazing. They can stand and walk within a few moments of being born. Mom licks off their face to make sure they can breathe, and then they're up and sucking within, most of them within 5-10 minutes at the most, and they're wobbling around on their cute little hobbly knees. So I told you that we have 3 calves right now. I'm also going to tell you that the first calf that was born died because it was eaten by a coyote. And so it was born a couple weeks ago, and yeah, that one didn't make it. And the coyotes, they'll hang around during calving time. So cows, when they have their calves, they have the placenta, and I don't know if most folks know this or not, but cows actually eat their placenta after it's born. It serves 2 functions. One, it's to get as many nutrients back in their body as possible when they're super depleted after pregnancy. The second reason is to keep the smell away from the predators. So coyotes will actually hang around in calving time, and if they can, they'll come and steal that placenta away. And if they also can, they will come and steal those calves. And so it's this interesting one because your sense of justice for those adorable little babies, right, might kick in. But it is sort of a life for a life in a lot of ways. And then it comes into our human value system, right? Are we valuing that coyote's life more than we're valuing that calf's life? And as a farmer or rancher in the area, when that calf is certainly tied to your way of life and your livelihood, then you're valuing that calf's life more than you're valuing the coyote's. And so this has been a continual issue. You know, we talked about the notion of settlers coming in back in the day, and we're bringing in agriculture, we're bringing domesticated animals. So the way that the relationship to animals changes, and therefore the relationship to predators changes. And it's not that folks that lived here beforehand, right, like indigenous people all across the continent, they were still hunting these animals, to be sure. But the difference was that there's sort of a difference between co-competing for the same resource than being directly attacked for your resource. And I think that's the notion of where a lot more fear gets built up. Kind of take a step back and look at it. I don't know, that's my own theory anyways. But we get to this notion that it's not just competition now, it's this direct threat. And that's been true for, wolves have been hunted out. Coyotes are still very very much a complicated matter when you are someone who works with livestock. And so when I was growing up back in 2009, so I'm from Saskatchewan. That's one of our prairie provinces in Canada, kind of one of our bread belt, or kind of like our bread belt, same sort of comparison for folks in the States. So back in 2009, when I was still a teenager, our provincial government introduced, they started a pilot program. It was called the Saskatchewan Coyote Control Program. And what they did was they paid anyone who brought in 4 paws, they paid $20 to. I'm going to tell you that out of that program, 71,000 coyotes were shot and killed, and the bounty was collected for. There might have even been more depending if the bounties were brought in. So 70,000, potentially even more, maybe upwards of 100, were killed off in an attempt to, because it was getting bad. Lots of people were losing parts of their herd, especially sheep farmers. That's a really hard one because that is prey that a single coyote can take. Calves they can sometimes get if the mother isn't paying attention, or they'll hunt it in smaller packs. But I'm going to tell you that those 70,000 that were killed, it's now, what are we, 15 years later, give or take a little bit. It did not resolve the issue. And this is what I think is so fascinating. So I want to bring us back to what Lewis said from Lewis and Clark Expedition. I want to bring us back to what I was saying earlier. When he was talking about coyotes, he was talking about them living in family units of 10 to 12 and sometimes even more. So that's what Lewis said about coyotes. I said that where I grew up, coyotes hunt alone, which is a very different thing. Now, you could argue that that has to do with place. Again, where the expedition was the northeastern Montana, very similar ecosystem to where I grew up. Now, it comes back down to the basic social unit of coyotes, which is also a reason why killing them off didn't work, why the bounty system didn't work. So their social unit, their family unit, is structured around a single productive female. Sometimes you'll have unrelated coyotes that will join temporarily, either for companionship or hunting larger animals. But those non-family units are usually temporary. Maybe they're bachelors or non-reproductive females or teenagers. So those will usually break up. But usually they're based around a family unit. Families form in midwinter when a female is an estrus, when she's ready to breed, and bonding pairs will form shortly after copulation. So those family units, there'll be a single female in heat. Lots of males will follow around, but she is monogamous. They pick a single pair. The other males, if they don't get picked, they kind of trot off and they don't make it a big deal out of it. And then other females in the area, if they don't manage to breed or if they're too young, they'll actually support rearing that one family. So within a certain area or range, there is usually only one adult breeding pair. And either through family bonds or through submission, they don't let anyone else breed in that area. And so it's that family structure that is the reason why mass hunting doesn't work. So when you have a functioning alpha male female breeding pair, they don't allow others to breed. They have smaller pack sizes, they have smaller litter sizes because they already have an established pack. Now, what happens if you knock out an alpha or an alpha pair is that you then open up the hierarchy to breeding. Now, any of age female or sexually reproductive female will now breed, and they're all in that same area simultaneously competing. They also change their social behavior. So packs become unstable, and so they no longer have that. They start living in isolation, which also, again, if you think about how I grew up in a place that has had livestock for over 100 years, has had heavy hunting for 100 years. And so I actually can't speak for the total number of coyotes in the area, whether or not it's changed or not, but certainly the way they live has changed. And they now live in single units away from these family structures, which means that almost all females are likely breeders now. Right? If we go back a couple 100 years, 300 years, you would have had family structures of 10 or 12 where only one is a breeding pair. Now we have every single lone female behaving as a breeding pair. Now, if you add in those hunting stresses, females are also breeding at a younger age, and because they're stressed, it might seem counterintuitive, but they're actually having larger litter sizes. So stable populations have small litter sizes, threatened populations have larger litter sizes. It kind of goes back to, for anyone who's from the coast, it was like the war on sea stars back in the day when the sea stars were competing for the shellfish industry. And so all the fisher folk, they went and they chopped up all the starfish, and they're like, we'll show you starfish. we'll take care of this. But starfish, if anyone remembers their fun biology, is that every arm turns into a whole starfish. So it's not quite as literal as that, but it's right on the same trend that if you break up these family units, which we've done more or less for the last 50, 70 years, longer really, we have now changed their social system in such a way that they are all breeding all the time. And we've also created a different ecosystem. We've opened up plains. We've expanded it to the north, south, east, west. And so coyotes have just spread all across North America. Uh, and so unlike a lot of their contemporary predators, they arguably are doing very well. Now, I'm not going to say individual coyote populations are doing very well, but as a whole species, they are adapting. That, they are the trickster god. They are there to be resilient and to adapt to anything that comes their way. And they've taken sort of this colonial expansion in stride. And yes, the way that they live has changed, but their species as a whole is doing quite well. And so for my own journey, it's kind of an interesting one. I will admit I grew up very rural, and coyotes were a pest growing up. And I have grown up and I've moved around, I've traveled, I've lived in lots of places. Um, and it's more confusing for me coming home this time, right? Because I see that the fact is that yes, those three coyotes that live uh, right in my neighborhood, they are the ones that, like, it is that population that is an immediate threat to those little calves that are born this spring. That it's my job, or as maybe that's not what I was saying, but as someone who does care for domestic animals, you are responsible for their care. So there is this care of negligence if you let them be predated upon. There is also this other ecosystem perspective of, like, I don't have a problem with coyotes existing. I have a problem with them eating domesticated resources or our domesticated animals that we're supposed to be stewarding, but they still have a role in this ecosystem. And I think that's the thing that's important, right? As we tile this together, is that coyotes, and this is also big, right? Like, humans, we do fill a lot of roles in the ecosystem, but we can't fill them all, right? So predators are really important. Coyotes are one of those carnivore populations, or mesocarnivores, that actually increase a lot of different diversity, right? So if we have coyotes move in, then it counteracts things like foxes, raccoons, skunks, which are often predating on things like ground nesting birds, right? So there are all of these ripple effects to the ecosystem. They're also really important for controlling rodent and rabbit populations, excuse me, right? So if anyone has ever had a chance to watch a fox or a coyote hunt, it is one of the funniest and funnest things to experience, because they do this, like, pounce on the grass. It's very fun to watch. I hope you all get to see it at some point in your lives. But that's a huge part. Those species are very much these bust boom critters. And so you need to have predators in order to balance it out. Otherwise, they can completely devastate a landscape. Another one, which maybe is not as glamorous, but is also extremely important, is alongside, like, our vulture friends, who again don't get a lot of human love, or depending on which culture you're from anyways. But they are very big, important role as scavengers, right? Of converting those nutrients back into the environment, spreading them around. That's a really important role. And another thing is, we think about the narrative of where coyotes fit in, right? So they do have this role that they play, this active role that we often don't acknowledge. And then we also, on the other hand, overemphasize this sort of base fear that we have of predators. So this is a stat from, I think, 2017. And so this notion of coyotes as a threat, specifically to humans, if we're going to ignore livestock for a second, but right. So there was a study done from the 38 years from 1977 to 2015. And in that 38-year period, there were 367 documented attacks by non-rabid coyotes. Things that have rabies that's a whole different ballgame. I don't disagree with that. But non-rabid coyotes, there's been about 350, let's say. In comparison, in that time, and we're just talking about the US for now, there have been more than 4.5 million dog bites. Also, to clarify, out of those 350, there were 2 that did result in death. So they were severe. I'm not saying they weren't. But again, there were 4.5 million dog bites, of which about 1 million of them required medical attention. So we have accepted one predator into our lives and the risks of that, but for some reason we there's still an otherness, right? If it's not the one that sleeps on our couch with us, then it doesn't have this place in our world. So it's a bit of a double standard. So hopefully that narrative can change, because coyotes are certainly here to stay. And as I remember, if you remember, they're really still expanding. So as of 20, sort of, there was the first evidence in kind of like the early mid 2010s, right? But they're expanding. There's been hybridization with different dog breeds in the south. So they've been seen as far south now as Panama, which is crazy. Um, it's just such a different narrative. When we talk about conservation and we talk about we're losing all these species, and we are in lots of different ways, but I think we forget that we are also paving the way for a lot of generalists, and that comes with pros and cons, right? Coyotes are clever generalists that can adapt. So that means that we're having one species that's sort of taking over multiple ecosystems. And I'm not going to say for better or worse, but just that it's another way of change that I think we're not acknowledging. There's not just loss, there are vacuums to be filled when that loss is created. So, holy smokes, I'm going to finish on time today. Look at that. All right. So, to wrap that all together, I think that these coyotes, as a species, as an individual, as key narratives in our children's stories and our daily stories, depending on where your life lives, they really are these very impressive, intelligent creatures. And I think at least I'll speak for myself, I admire them. I see them as, they are kind of our mirror of humanity, of our cleverness, and how our foolishness gets us into trouble as often as it gets us out. Um, and that, the thing about the trickster is that it's very amoral. It's not about good or bad. Right? Sometimes sometimes does do things with intention, but a lot of times it's just doing the things for doing things. And much like humans, I think we do that, right? I think we do something just because we can, and in true trickster fashion, we find out the consequences of it after. Um, and as one who likes to plan ahead a lot, I get frustrated by that. But that is kind of the base of being human, right? It is to sort of grow and expand. So hopefully, like the coyote, we can have a friend like Fox who will come and pick us up after we maybe crumble into pieces. But with that, I will end it there, and I will pass it back to you, Sunny.
Kristina, thank you so much. We've got a few questions, but I just want to remind everybody that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. Let's start with, do you know if there are folks who take coyotes as pets?
Ooh. So I'm sure there are. It's not allowed, at least in my province, and I think in Canada. I'm not sure what the rules are like in the States, but yeah, like hybrids happen, right, between people's dogs. It's the same as, I'm trying to think of what a valid comparison is. Coyotes have not been domesticated in the same sense of a lot of other species because they don't have the same tendencies. I think is where that really comes from. And not that it's not possible, I would say, um, but yeah, I wouldn't
Mhm.
I wouldn't encourage it either. I just there's a whole bunch of things about domestication, right? Because you could argue that, if we go back 10,000 years, the dogs that we have now are just a cousin of a coyote. So what's wrong with it today? But we're getting into moral ground that I'm going to say is above my pay grade.
Okay. Good answer. Um, at what age can females start to breed? And do you know how many litters they might have during their lifetime and what their life expectancy would be?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think sexually mature for most of them will be around a year. Again, if you have intact social structures, they probably won't be breeding just yet, but viably it to be around a year. And as far as life expectancy, I'm actually not sure on that. As I think about this, I want to say it's between that 7 to 10 range. They are capable of having like a litter every single year, and they would. So if you do the math on that, maybe your average female would have between maybe 5 to 7 litters in her life, assuming healthiness all the way through.
Hmm. Okay. And you know, speaking of healthiness, what diseases might affect coyotes?
Yeah, so they are big proponents of rabies. That's probably what I've seen the most, definitely growing up. Um, I would say I see them every year, every other year, where I grew up. It inevitably kind of rolls through. And then outside of that, I don't know. Don't quote me on this. One thing that went through the prairies really bad um, was called chronic wasting disease, and that went through deer. And they do know that it can transfer over to different species, but I'm not sure if coyotes also got hit by that. I wouldn't necessarily put it past them, or like I think it might have veered in, but again, don't quote me on that one either. And then beyond that, yeah, kind of I would say you're sort of same pest. They can have same things like they can get trichinella worms, um, right? You've got fleas, ticks. I'm assuming they can still get Lyme disease from ticks, same as we can, things like that.
Okay. Um, one of our viewers noticed a large gray canid in southern Florida, and people said it was a coy wolf hybrid. Do you have
Hmm.
any knowledge of coy wolves or a hybrid between coyotes and wolves?
Yeah, so that's what I was kind of talking about a bit earlier, and I'm assuming they probably make their way as far south in Florida as well, but sort of in like north of Virginia and up through there, and then and going down south as well. So that's that overlap because we've had coyotes expand westwards and meet up with different eastern wolf populations. So very odds that it is a hybrid, of which sort of proportion, who really knows? Um, Most likely probably still on like the coyote dominant side, I would say. Just and I'm only saying that just based off of population, right? There are just a lot fewer wolves than there are coyotes, so the odds are that if we come across hybrids, we would expect them to be more likely, more genetically a coyote than a wolf, depending on what's left there. But yeah, I will say biologists get real sensitive. But I'm not speaking for myself. I'm just careful of names because uh, is it a coyote? Is it a wolf? People enjoy calling it co-wolves or coy wolves up north, right? When we're talking about crossovers between polar bears and brown bears, is it a Is it a what do they call it? Pisley's growler. Um, I yeah, I would just stick with calling them hybrids because then is it really a new species? Where do we draw that line at? Again, those are things that people argue over for decades and then eventually look back on and be like, okay, there's the imaginary line. So hard to
Hmm.
say.
So fascinating. Well, thank you so much. That's the last question we have time for today. So I will hand it back to you for closing comments.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Sunny, and thank you everyone for indulging with me on sharing some of my home, maybe a bit of my home culture and things like that as well. Uh, and for myself, I always appreciate getting to tie in how I live with an animal, sort of compared to other places, across this country or even wider, of how different ways we can all coexist. So I hope if you do have coyotes in your neighborhood, give them a nod of respect and maybe just think about how you can live your life in a way that does support them living alongside, right? It is simple things as how you store your trash, especially for our urban coyotes, and there is a big population of them. Don't even don't question that one, um, right? And yeah, I think it's all about how we sort of choose to participate. So thank you everyone for your time, and I appreciate you tuning in.
Well, thank you again, Christina, for the sharing your knowledge and your personal experience. It's always so interesting to hear, somebody who really grew up um, in a different situation than many of us did and has a different perspective. So thank you for that personal touch tonight. Um, that is it for today. So I just want to thank everybody who tuned in. Please join us again tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.